David had always been proud of the old car sitting in his driveway. It was not just a car to him. It was a piece of his life, something he had worked on with his own hands for years. The car was a vintage Mustang, the kind people slowed down to stare at whenever they passed by. Its shiny red paint reflected sunlight like glass, and the chrome parts sparkled as if they had just come out of the factory. Every weekend, David would bring out his bucket, soap, and cloth, spending hours polishing the hood, cleaning the wheels, and making sure every inch looked perfect. Some neighbors thought he was too obsessed, but to David, it was a passion. The Mustang wasn't new, but it carried stories inside it. He had bought it when it was almost junk, rust eating away at the doors and the engine refusing to start. For years, he had worked patiently, sometimes staying up late in his garage with grease on his hands, fixing, replacing, and restoring. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't cheap. There were nights when he wondered if it was worth the trouble, but every time he thought of giving up, he reminded himself that the car was more than metal, and wheels it was a dream he had carried since he was a teenager. When the car finally roared back to life after months of effort, it felt like victory. He parked the car in his driveway every day, where he could see it from his living room window. He liked the feeling of looking out and seeing something he built with his own two hands. Sometimes strangers passing through the neighborhood would stop to admire it. Kids pointed at it, saying it looked like a car from the movies. Older folks nodded with approval, remembering their own youth when cars like this ruled the roads. To David, those little moments made all the hard work worth it, but not everyone looked at the car with admiration. A few people saw it with greedy eyes. It started with two men who appeared in the neighborhood one afternoon. They wore clothes that looked like uniforms, dark shirts with shiny badges pinned on and caps with the word HOA security stitched across. They walked around the street with clipboards, stopping near houses, writing things down, and sticking papers on car windshields. At first glance, they looked official, like they belonged to some neighborhood association. But something about them felt off. David had lived in that neighborhood for years and knew there wasn't any real homeowners association with cops. There was a local committee that organized cleanups and sometimes sent out newsletters. But nobody had ever heard of security officers with badges. These two men, however, acted as if they owned the place. They walked with stiff posture, carried radios clipped to their belts, and talked loudly to each other about violations. When David first noticed them, he was sitting on his porch, with a cup of coffee, watching them from a distance. He frowned as they walked up to a neighbor's SUV and slapped a notice on the windshield. Then they stopped at another car, pointing and shaking their heads as if something was terribly wrong. The whole act seemed theatrical, like a cheap performance. It wasn't long before they reached his house. David felt his stomach tighten when he saw them slow down in front of his driveway. One of them, tall and broad with a trimmed beard, leaned over to whisper something to the other. The shorter man scribbled notes on his clipboard, then took a picture of the Mustang with his phone. David stood up, now watching more closely. The two men didn't even glance at him. They just kept circling the car, looking at it from every angle, as though they were appraisers checking its worth. A wave of unease washed over David. He stepped down from the porch and asked what they were doing. The tall man gave a quick fake smile and said, "Routine inspection. HOA rules, sir. This vehicle may not meet neighborhood standards." David almost laughed. There was no rule in the world that said a beautifully restored classic car was a problem. In fact, it was the opposite. His car made the street look better, told them he had never heard of any such inspection, and that they had no business touching his property. The men exchanged a look, but didn't argue. Instead, they simply moved on, muttering something under their breath. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. A day later, David noticed the same two men again, driving slowly down his street in a battered pickup truck. The truck had magnetic signs on the side with the words "Community Enforcement" printed in bold letters. But the letters were crooked, as though the signs had been made quickly and stuck on without care. The truck itself rattled, nothing like an official vehicle. Still, they acted confident, stopping at different houses and scribbling notes. Again, their eyes lingered on the Mustang. David watched them from behind his curtain this time, staying out of sight. One of them pulled out a camera again, snapping more pictures of the car. It was obvious now they weren't interested in enforcing any rules. They were interested in his car. David's mind raced. Classic cars like his were worth thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands if sold to the right buyer. His Mustang, with all the work he had put in, would fetch a big price. He began to realize these men weren't security officers at all. They were scammers, pretending to be HOA enforcers so they could target valuable cars and tow them away. Without raising suspicion, the thought made his blood boil. That car wasn't just money, it was years of his life, his pride, his hard work. The idea that someone could stroll in, throw chains around it, and drive off was unbearable. He had seen news reports before about cars disappearing overnight, stolen by fake towing companies. Now it was happening right in front of him. That evening, David sat on his porch again, this time with a stronger sense of awareness. Every sound on the street made him turn his head. Every pair of headlights in the distance made him wonder if it was them coming back. He ran his hand along the car's smooth surface, feeling the cool metal under his palm, and promised himself he wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The neighborhood around him was quiet. The kind of suburban calm where people thought nothing bad could ever happen. Kids played on their bikes, neighbors watered their lawns, and dogs barked lazily behind fences. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary evening. But to David, there was tension in the air. The fake officers were out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the street, David's eyes stayed fixed on his car. The Mustang gleamed even in the fading light, a bright target for anyone with bad intentions. He could almost feel the weight of the stranger's stares from earlier, the way they circled like vultures. Deep down, he knew this wasn't over. They had already marked his car, and they would come back. It was only a matter of time. And when they did, David told himself he would be ready. The two men were not just random troublemakers. They had a plan, and it was not their first time pulling it off. Their whole trick depended on looking official enough to fool people, but not attracting too much attention. They used cheap uniforms, fake badges, and an old pickup truck with magnetic decals to make themselves look like some kind of neighborhood authority. To most people glancing out their window, it seemed believable. They acted confident, moved with purpose, and spoke in loud, commanding voices. That was usually enough to scare residents into staying quiet. Their scam worked like this. They drove through neighborhoods, pretending to be HOA security officers or community enforcement. They looked for valuable cars, ones that stood out, ones that could fetch money if stolen. Then they would write fake violation notices, take photos, and sometimes even mark the car with chalk as if it were scheduled for towing. After a day or two, they would return late at night with their truck, hook the car, and drive off. Most people, waking up to find their car gone, assumed the HOA or city had towed it. By the time they figured out the truth, the car was already gone, stripped for parts or sold under the table. David didn't know all the details of their history, but he understood enough from watching them. He had caught them circling his Mustang, taking photos, writing notes, and pretending they had authority. He noticed the way their eyes gleamed when they looked at the car, like hunters spotting prey. It was clear they had already chosen their next target as car. One evening, as the neighborhood was settling into quiet, David spotted their truck again. This time, they parked farther down the street, just out of clear sight. But David saw the faint glow of a phone screen as one of them zoomed in, snapping pictures of his driveway. They weren't just passing through. They were studying his house, his habits, and waiting for the right chance. A shiver ran down his spine. The next day, David decided to keep a closer eye on things. He spent more time on his porch pretending to relax with a book, but really scanning the street. Sure enough, by mid-afternoon, the same truck rolled past again. The shorter man leaned out the window, pointing toward David's property as if giving directions to the driver. David caught the movement and felt anger rise in his chest. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Later that evening, David thought about how professional their act looked from a distance. The fake uniforms had patches stitched onto them, not perfect, but convincing enough in low light. The badges were shiny and reflected like real metal, though he suspected they were cheap knockoffs. The truck, though old and rattling, carried decals that read Community Enforcement Division. To someone unfamiliar with the area, it looked official enough. To someone tired, busy, or distracted, it could easily trick them into believing these men had authority. But David was not so easily fooled. He had lived in this neighborhood for years and knew every person on the local committee. Nobody had ever mentioned a security division, and certainly nobody had ever spoken of towing cars without notice. He realized their whole scheme depended on fear and confusion. Most people, when confronted with men in uniforms carrying clipboards, wouldn't dare to argue. That hesitation gave the scammers all the time they needed. As he thought about it, David remembered something else. A news story he had read online months earlier about cars disappearing in nearby neighborhoods. Police had warned residents about fake tow operators posing as city workers. Back then, he had dismissed it, thinking it was something that happened far away, not in his quiet suburb. Now it felt frighteningly close. That night, sleep didn't come easily. David kept picturing the men's faces, the way they whispered to each other while circling his Mustang. He imagined waking up one morning to an empty driveway, his beloved car gone forever, and the sick feeling of knowing he had been tricked. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the thought. The next morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going to just sit and wait. He began to prepare. First, he checked the locks on his gate and garage, making sure they were secure. Then he tested the motion sensor lights on the side of his house. They flickered on, bright and strong, enough to flood the driveway in light if anyone approached. After that, he checked the small cameras he had set up months ago. They were still working, recording everything. He repositioned one of them so it faced directly at the Mustang. Throughout the day, he noticed the truck again. It slowed near his house, the men leaning forward, watching. He stood in the driveway, wiping down his car, and locked eyes with them as they passed. The taller one smirked like a predator, unbothered by being seen. That smirk sent a chill down David's spine. It was the kind of look that said, "We'll be back, and you can't stop us."
Ow.
David clenched his jaw. They thought they were clever, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. He wasn't the kind of man to roll over quietly. His Mustang was not just a car. It was part of him, and if they wanted it, they would have to fight harder than they imagined. The men's plan was clear. They were setting up their scam step by step. First came the fake notices and photos, giving the appearance of legality. Next would come the intimidation, making David believe his car violated some fake rule. Then, when the stage was set, they would arrive at night, hook the car, and disappear. It was a script they had likely played out many times before. But this time, they had chosen the wrong driveway. David knew it. Could almost sense the moment approaching when they would finally try to make their move. They had circled too many. Times stared too long and marked their interest too clearly. It wasn't a question of if they would return, but when. As the day faded into evening, David felt the tension rising. The quiet suburban streets suddenly seemed different, like a stage waiting for a performance no one else could see coming. Neighbors watered their lawns, kids rode bikes, and porch lights clicked on. But beneath that ordinary calm was an undercurrent of danger. The scammers had set their eyes on the prize, and David's Mustang was the star of their scheme. He knew. He had to be ready because when they returned, it wouldn't just be a casual drive-by. They would come with chains, hooks, and the nerve to steal. And this time, David promised himself they would not leave so easily. David knew by now that the two men were not going to stop. He had circled the neighborhood too many times, and their greedy eyes had stayed on his Mustang long enough to confirm his fears. They were planning something, and if he just sat back and waited, his car might be gone in the blink of an eye. He had worked too hard and poured too much of his life into restoring it to let that happen. So he made up his mind he was going to set a trap. David had an advantage that the fake officers could never have guessed. He wasn't just some ordinary car owner. Over the years, he had built a career training security dogs. It had started as a small hobby when he was younger, helping local families teach their pets basic obedience, but it grew into something bigger. Eventually, he became known for training dogs to protect property, respond to commands instantly, and handle dangerous situations without losing control. His dogs weren't just pets. They were highly disciplined partners, loyal to him, and trained for real threats at home. David had two of his best-trained dogs, Rex and Shadow. Rex was a large German shepherd, muscular and sharp-eyed, the kind of dog that made intruders think twice before taking a step closer. Shadow, on the other hand, was a Belgian Malinois, quicker and leaner, with lightning-fast reflexes and a bark that could freeze someone in their tracks. Together they were a team, and David trusted them more than he trusted most people. The plan started to form in his head. He knew the scammers liked to come late at night, when the streets were quiet and most people were asleep. That's when they would try to hook up the Mustang and vanish before anyone noticed. But instead of hiding his car, David decided to leave it right there in the driveway, exactly where they expected it to be. He wanted them to take the bait. Before the night came, David made his preparations. He checked all his security cameras again, adjusting the angles to make sure they covered the entire driveway and the front yard. He even tested the recording by walking across the driveway himself, then reviewing the footage. The cameras picked up every step clearly, and that gave him confidence. He wanted every second of what was about to happen captured as evidence. Next, he checked the motion sensor lights. When he waved his hand, they flashed on instantly, flooding the driveway with brightness. That sudden burst of light would startle anyone sneaking around in the dark, and it would make the cameras capture even clearer footage. He smiled to himself, knowing he had turned his home into a stage where the scammers would expose themselves, but the heart of his plan was Rex and Shadow. David spent the early evening with them, giving them extra exercise to keep their energy sharp and their focus steady. He took them through drills in the backyard, commanding them to sit, stay, and charge at his signal. Their discipline impressed him, as always. These were not dogs that barked at every noise or chased shadows. They waited for his word, and when he gave it, they moved like soldiers carrying out an order. As night fell, David set the scene. He left the front gate open just enough for someone to walk through, making it look as if he had been careless. The Mustang sat proudly in the driveway, polished and shining even under the dim glow of the streetlights. To the scammers, it would look like the perfect opportunity: an open gate, an exposed car, and a quiet street. They would never guess what was waiting inside. David positioned Rex and Shadow just behind the side of the house, where they could not be seen from the street. He gave them hand signals to stay low and stay quiet. The dogs obeyed, their ears perked, their bodies tense, but controlled. They were ready to move at the first sign of trouble. Inside his house, David kept the lights low and the front window slightly open. From there, he could watch without being seen. His phone was ready in his hand, set to record and also dial the police if needed. Every few minutes, he glanced at the cameras on his screen, checking for any sign of movement. Hours passed slowly, the quiet of the night broken only by the occasional sound of a car far away or the chirping of crickets. Around midnight, it happened. The familiar rattling of the fake enforcement truck reached his ears. David leaned forward, his heart beating faster. The truck crept down the street, its headlights dimmed, moving as quietly as it could for such a beat-up vehicle. It slowed in front of his house and stopped. 2 doors opened, and the men stepped out, dressed again in their fake uniforms. Even in the darkness, David could see their confidence. They moved quickly, as if they had done this many times before.
One man
Carried a heavy chain, the kind used to hook a car to a tow truck. The other held a flashlight, though he kept it low to avoid drawing attention. They whispered to each other, glancing around the street. Seeing no one awake, they walked straight into David's driveway. The shorter one pointed at the Mustang, whispering something excitedly. The taller man nodded, bending down to start hooking the chain onto the front bumper. David stayed still, holding his breath. His finger hovered over the button on his phone, ready to trigger both the recording and the call. But he didn't move. Yet, he wanted them to get close enough. Wanted their confidence to grow so the fall would be even harder. Rex and Shadow, hidden in the shadows of the side yard, noticed the intruders immediately. Their bodies stiffened and their ears shot forward. David gave a subtle hand signal through the window weight. The dogs froze, their muscles twitching with anticipation. But they held their ground, completely silent. The scammers had no idea. What was about to happen? The shorter man leaned against the car, grinning as he pulled out a clipboard and pretended to check off some fake violation code. The taller man grunted as he secured the hook, preparing to pull the chain tight. They were seconds away from trying to haul the Mustang away. David finally gave the signal. He whistled softly, a sharp sound that cut through the night air. Instantly, Rex and Shadow burst from their hiding spot, their paws pounding the ground. Like thunder, their deep, fierce barks shattered the silence, echoing off the houses. The sudden noise and movement hit the scammers like a wave. The men froze, wide-eyed, as the two powerful dogs charged straight toward them. Rex's teeth flashed in the glow of the motion sensor lights as they flicked on, flooding the driveway. With brightness, Shadow circled fast, barking furiously, cutting off the men's escape route. The taller one dropped the chain in shock, stumbling backward while the shorter one shouted in panic. His fake clipboard falling to the ground. From his porch, David stepped into view, phone in hand, recording everything. He called out calmly, his voice steady. "You picked the wrong house. The dogs didn't touch the men, but they didn't need to. Their sheer presence, the snarling, the growling, the way they snapped their jaws just inches away was enough to make the scammers shake with fear. Every move they made, the dogs adjusted, blocking them, forcing them back toward the open gate, but never letting them leave to isolate the once confident scammers, who had strutted into the driveway as if they owned the place, were now stumbling, shouting, and nearly tripping over themselves. Their plan had collapsed in seconds, and David had every moment of it captured on camera. He stood tall, one hand steadying his phone, and the other giving signals to his dogs. Rex and Shadow obeyed perfectly, holding the men at bay, but never losing control. David's heart pounded, but he felt a surge of pride. His trap had worked exactly as he had planned. The scammers had no idea what kind of house they had chosen, and now they were paying the price for their mistake. The two men who had marched into the driveway full of confidence were no longer the same. A few minutes earlier, they had believed everything was in their control, had their fake uniforms, their chains, and their crooked truck waiting on the street. They thought David's Mustang would be theirs before the clock struck 1. But now the whole scene had flipped. Instead of calmly hooking the car and sneaking away, they found themselves face to face with two trained security dogs that moved with precision and power. Rex lunged forward first, his deep growl shaking the air as his paws slammed against the ground. His teeth flashed under the bright flood of the motion sensor lights. Shadow darted sideways, circling so quickly that the men didn't know where to look. One moment he was at their left, barking furiously, and the next he was behind them, cutting off any path to the truck. The fake officers were trapped in a living nightmare. Their own footsteps tangled as they stumbled and shouted in panic. The taller man dropped the heavy chain he had been holding. It clattered against the driveway with a sharp metallic sound. He raised his hand slightly, not in surrender exactly, but in fear, as if he thought the dogs might leap at him any second. The shorter man spun in circles, trying to keep both animals in sight. His flashlight fell from his grip, rolling across the ground, the beams slicing random lines of light into the night. David stepped out from the porch then, phone in hand, recording everything. The sight of him standing calmly with his camera made the men look even more foolish. They had crept in like predators, but now they were caught like rats in a trap. David's voice carried across the yard, steady and clear. "Didn't expect this, did you?" The taller man tried to bluff, his voice shaky but loud. "Call off the dogs. We're on official business." He gestured weakly toward his fake badge, which glinted under the light. But David didn't even pretend to take him seriously. He let out a short laugh, cold and dismissive, then called his dogs by name. Rex and Shadow responded instantly, tightening the circle, moving closer, barking so fiercely that the men staggered backward until their backs nearly touched the gate. The night air was alive with chaos. Neighbors began switching on their porch lights, woken by the furious barking. A window slid open across the street, and someone peeked out to see what was happening. Another neighbor stepped outside with a phone in hand, holding it high to get a better view. The fake officers, who had hoped to go unnoticed, were now the center of unwanted attention. Their plan depended on silence and darkness. But here they were, surrounded by noise, light, and eyes watching from every direction. Shadow let out a bark, loud and sharp that the shorter man nearly tripped over his own feet. "They're going to bite us," he shouted, his voice cracking. His partner snapped back. "Don't move. Just don't move." But they were trembling, their fake authority melting away with every passing second. David took a step closer, his phone still aimed at them. "Everything you've done is on camera," he said firmly. "Every picture you took of my car, every second you've been here. You tried to steal my property, and now everyone can see exactly who you are." The taller man's bravado finally cracked. We're just enforcing rules," he stammered. This vehicle violates the HOA standards." He stopped mid-sentence when Rex lunged forward again, barking so fiercely that spit flew into the air. The man's words died in his throat, replaced by raw fear. The shorter one started inching toward the gate, but Shadow darted in front of him, blocking the exit. His bark echoed like thunder, and the man froze, his eyes wide, his body stiff. David gave a sharp whistle, and both dogs stepped closer, forcing the men to stay exactly where they were. The power in that moment wasn't just in the dog's strength, but in their discipline. They didn't attack wildly. They moved with precision, responding to every small signal from David. The men could see it in their eyes. These weren't ordinary dogs barking at strangers. They were trained protectors, and every movement carried purpose. By now, the street was fully awake. More porch lights flickered on, and whispers drifted across the road as neighbors gathered quietly at the edges of their yards. A few people even began filming on their phones. The scammers who had counted on Shadows to hide them were now standing in a pool of bright light with an audience watching their humiliation. The taller man snapped suddenly, his fear turning to anger. "You don't know who you're messing with?" he shouted at David, but the words rang hollow. His voice shook, and the sight of Rex standing only a foot away, teeth bared, made him look ridiculous. David tilted his head, unimpressed, then said, "I know exactly who I'm messing with. 2 criminals in cheap costumes trying to steal my car." The dogs barked again, so loudly that the sound seemed to shake the ground. The shorter man covered his ears, shouting something about calling a lawyer, but nobody believed him. The neighbors across the street laughed quietly, muttering to each other about how fake the uniforms looked. The scammers had no escape. They couldn't run to their truck because the dogs would block them. They couldn't stand still without being barked at, their bodies frozen in fear. David finally decided to take the last step. He raised his phone to his ear and dialed. The police, speaking calmly while keeping the camera pointed at the men. "Yes, officers. I need you to come quickly. I have 2 men impersonating security officials on my property, attempting to tow my vehicle. I have everything on video. They're being held here safely by my trained dogs." The men's faces drained of color. The tall one muttered curses under his breath, glancing toward the street as if hoping to run, but Rex growled low and deep, freezing him in place. The shorter one tried to plead, his voice desperate. "Look, man, it's just a misunderstanding. We weren't really going to take it." "We were just checking." His excuse fell apart as Shadow barked again, silencing him with sheer force. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. The men trapped, the dog standing guard, and David recording every second. The neighborhood was no longer quiet. A few people whispered to each other, some even chuckling at the ridiculous sight of the scammers trembling. What had begun as a silent theft had turned into a public display of failure. Finally, the faint wail of sirens reached their ears. The scammers froze completely, their eyes darting around like cornered animals. Rex and Shadow stood taller, their bodies still tense but ready. David gave them a soft command to hold position. They obeyed instantly, never breaking their focus. The red and blue lights appeared down the street, flashing against the houses. The fake officers looked at each other with panic, their last shred of fake confidence gone. They had walked into the driveway thinking they were hunters, but now they stood as prey, surrounded by neighbors, watched by cameras, and guarded by two loyal dogs who had been trained for exactly this kind of night. The sound of the sirens grew louder, echoing down the quiet street. Blue and red lights flashed across the houses, cutting through the night and making the scene look almost unreal. The two fake officers, who had once strutted around with confidence, were now shaking like guilty schoolboys caught in the act. They stood frozen, their fake uniforms and badges looking cheap and ridiculous under the harsh glow of the police headlights. Rex and Shadow kept them cornered, their low growls rumbling like thunder. David stayed calm, one hand still recording. On his phone, the other signaling the dogs to hold their ground. He had planned for this moment, but even so, he felt a rush of relief when the real police finally pulled up. The scammers had thought they were in control, but now they were trapped with nowhere to run. The first officer stepped out of the patrol car, his flashlight shining straight at the two men. "What's going on here?" Gotti demanded, his voice sharp. The scammers immediately began talking over each other, shouting excuses, waving their hands, and pointing at David as if he was the problem. "We were HOA enforcement," one of them stammered. "We were just doing our job." The other nodded quickly, his words tumbling out. "This guy's currit's a violation, we had to tow it." The officer cut them off with a raised hand. His eyes scanned the scene, the dogs, the chain on the ground, the trembling men, and David standing calmly with his phone out. Something about it was obvious even to a stranger. The two men were liars. Real officers recognized fake authority quickly, and these imposters looked pathetic compared to the uniform standing before them. David stepped forward, careful to keep his dog steady. "Officer," he said firmly, "these men are frauds. They came onto my property pretending to be HOA cops. They tried to hook chains onto my car to tow it. I have everything recorded, photos, video, and even my security camera footage. They've been circling this neighborhood for days, targeting my vehicle." The officer nodded, motioning for David to show him the phone. David handed it over, and the video played clearly. It showed the scammers sneaking into the driveway, setting up their chain, and then panicking when the dogs charged. Every second was captured, undeniable proof of their intentions. The officer's expression hardened. He turned to his partner, who had been checking the scammer's truck. The partner shook his head and held up one of the magnetic decals. "Fake," he said simply. "Not even close to real." The two imposters looked pale, sweat glistening on their foreheads. Their confidence had completely drained away. Of them tried to make a final attempt at bluffing. This is all a mistake," he said, his voice trembling. We were just trying to keep the community safe," but his words died out when Shadow barked, the sound echoing through the street like a warning shot. The officer didn't look amused. "Keep quiet," he snapped. "You're done." Officers moved quickly, pulling handcuffs from their belts. The taller man tried to step back, but Rex let out a growl so deep that the man froze instantly. He lifted his hands, shaking, and the officers cuffed him without resistance. The shorter one whimpered as cold steel closed around his wrists. Both men were led toward the patrol car, their heads hanging low, Fake uniforms now, nothing but costumes that had betrayed them, as the scammers were pushed into the back seat of the police car. The neighborhood began to stir more boldly. Neighbors who had been peeking out from behind curtains stepped outside, some holding phones, others whispering in disbelief. "So they weren't real?" one woman asked. "All this time I thought they were actually with the HOA. Another man shook his head angrily. "They came by my house last week too, put some kind of notice on my son's car." The officers listened carefully, jotting down statements as more neighbors spoke up. It was clear the scammers had been working the entire area, not just targeting David. They had probably fooled others into thinking their cars were at risk. David's trap hadn't just saved his Mustang, it exposed a whole operation. David stood quietly, his dogs finally relaxed at his side. He scratched Rex behind the ears and patted Shadow's back, whispering praise to them for their perfect work. They wagged their tails lightly, their fierce growls replaced by calm obedience. Now that the danger had passed, looking at them, David felt a swell of pride. Without them, the scammers might have gotten away with his car. But with them, the tables had turned completely. One of the officers walked back to David and handed him his phone. "You did the right thing," the officer said. "Thanks to your footage, we've got them dead to rights." Impersonating officials. Attempted theft. Trespassing, the list is long. They won't be walking away from this. David nodded, relief washing over him. He looked at his Mustang sitting safely in the driveway, still gleaming under the lights. The sight filled him with satisfaction. The car that had once been nearly destroyed, the car he had brought back to life with his own hands, was still his. No scammer, no fake cop, no cheap con would take it away. As the patrol car pulled out of the street, carrying the arrested men away, neighbors gathered around David. Some clapped him on the back. Others praised his dogs, and a few admitted they had been nervous about those supposed HOA cops for weeks. "You saved us all a lot of trouble," one neighbor said. "If they'd gotten away with your car, who knows whose they would have taken next." David smiled modestly, but deep down, he felt a quiet pride. He hadn't just protected his own property, he had stopped a scam that could have hurt many others. His dogs stood proudly by his side, their eyes alert and their bodies relaxed, like guardians who had done their job perfectly. That night, after everyone had gone back inside and the street grew quiet again, David sat on his porch with Rex and Shadow lying at his feet. The Mustang shone under the moonlight, untouched and safe. Let out a long breath, finally able to relax. The events of the night had been tense, but the outcome was everything he had hoped for. He thought back to the moment the men had walked into his driveway, so sure of themselves, and how quickly their confidence had shattered. They had expected an easy theft, a quiet job under the cover of night. Instead, they had run into trained dogs, bright lights, cameras, and a homeowner who refused to be a victim. They had chosen the wrong house. And now they would spend their time explaining themselves in a courtroom instead of a driveway. For David, it was more than just winning. And courage could turn the tables on anyone trying to take advantage. And as he looked at his loyal dogs resting peacefully, he knew one thing for sure. Axe and Shadow weren't just pets. They were his protectors, his partners, the reason his classic Mustang was still exactly where it belonged. The night ended. Quietly, the fake cops were gone. The neighborhood felt safer, and David's car sat shining like a jewel. He leaned back in his chair, gave each dog a gentle pat, and whispered, "Good work, boys." The only answer was the calm rhythm of their breathing, steady and loyal, as they drifted into sleep at his feet.